Close your eyes and picture the Palace of Versailles. You'll likely see gleaming mirrors, immaculate gardens, and gates dripping with gold. Today, for us, it stands as the ultimate symbol of pristine beauty, but for the thousands who walked those glittering halls centuries ago, this palace was an overcrowded, stinking cesspool. Beneath the heavy silken perfume, it was a suffocating epicenter of human waste pooling in grand corridors, rampant parasites, and a horrific mortality rate where even kings rotted from the inside out. How did the most expensive palace in history function as a festering biological trap for Europe's elites? We might be tempted to say people back then simply did not understand germs. But the truth is far more deliberate. The squalor was the result of the political weaponization of architecture. To control the nobility, King Louis XIV forced 10,000 courtiers and servants to live in a single complex. He poured wealth into hydraulic engineering for his visual fountains, completely ignoring human sanitation. Imagine the hubris of the Sun King. He transformed a hunting lodge into an inescapable gilded cage, stripping nobles of power by making their lives revolve around his routine. But this brilliant design harbored a fatal contradiction. The biological mass of thousands of humans and animals living with zero plumbing created unbearable pressure. Courtiers relieved themselves in stairwells. Chamber pots were dumped out of windows, and those spectacular gardens became open-air latrines. The infrastructure could not support the political design. A terrifying challenger effortlessly bypassed the king's Swiss guards by forcing the elite into extreme, unsanitary proximity. Microbes ruthlessly exploited this structural flaw. Smallpox, dysentery, and measles moved freely from peasants to princes through contaminated water, filthy clothes, and stagnant air. To understand how the absolute pinnacle of European power became such a porous, deadly environment, we must discard the comfortable excuses of history. We often tell ourselves that the 17th century was simply a dirty era, that these aristocrats lacked our modern understanding of germs and basic hygiene. But ignorance alone cannot build a death trap of this magnitude. The filth of Versailles was not an accident of its time. It was the direct consequence of a hidden systemic variable. We are looking at the calculated political weaponization of architecture over fundamental human infrastructure. King Louis XIV had a singular vision: to control the unruly French nobility. He forced 10,000 courtiers, servants, and soldiers to abandon their sprawling estates and live together in a single, isolated complex. He poured the staggering wealth of an entire kingdom into mind-boggling hydraulic engineering, constructing 1,400 spectacular fountains that danced to his glory. Yet, in this sprawling monument to his ego, he deliberately ignored the basic mechanisms of human sanitation. There were no integrated sewers for the residents. Water was forcibly pumped miles uphill purely to feed the gardens, while the humans inside the palace walls were left to steep in their own biological runoff. This was the hubris of the Sun King, a breathtakingly arrogant triumph of political theater. He took a humble royal hunting lodge and violently expanded it into an inescapable, blindingly gilded cage. By centralizing the French government within these mirrored halls, he systematically stripped the old nobles of their independent military power. He reduced proud warlords to bickering courtiers whose entire existence depended on their physical proximity to his royal person. Their daily lives, their fortunes, and their survival now revolved strictly around the kindly routine of waking, eating, and sleeping. It was a seemingly invincible system of absolute monarchy, a clockwork universe where Louis was the sun and the nobles were merely trapped planets forced into his suffocating orbit. But this calculated political orbit held a catastrophic biological flaw. Imagine standing amidst 10,000 people and their animals, sealed inside a magnificent structure completely devoid of functional plumbing. The pressure of this daily reality was staggering. Grand staircases, built for sweeping royal descents, became dark corners where desperate courtiers relieved themselves against the marble. Beneath the heavy scent of imported perfumes, you would find the air thick with the suffocating stench of ammonia. Maids routinely emptied overflowing chamber pots out of towering windows, splashing the courtyards below. Even the spectacular gardens were reduced to open-air latrines. We can see the political machinery of Versailles cracking under the sheer weight of human waste. Louis XIV had built an impenetrable fortress against rebellion, but his Swiss guards were useless against a silent invader. By forcing the elites of Europe into such unsanitary proximity, The king constructed the perfect incubator for pathogens. This was an asymmetric war. Contaminated water, infested silks, and stagnant air allowed diseases to bridge the gap between commoners and kings. A scullery maid and a royal duke were now equals before the microscopic terrors of dysentery and smallpox. The devastating climax of this invisible siege arrived with terrifying speed in 1711. The tipping point was not a foreign invasion, but a domestic biological collapse. Within agonizing months, a lethal wave of disease swept through the royal family. First, smallpox struck down the Grand Dauphin, the king's only legitimate son and direct heir. Before the court could process this loss, a brutal strain of measles tore through the inner sanctum. It claimed the king's grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and mere days later, his eldest great-grandson. 3 generations of the Bourbon dynasty, the painstakingly secured future of the French Empire, were wiped out. The sun was setting on the Sun King, not on a glorious battlefield, but in the fever-soaked beds of his own magnificent death trap. This agonizing biological collapse did not spare anyone, least of all the innocent. Imagine the despair echoing through those gilded corridors as infant mortality skyrocketed within the royal nursery. Even the most powerful monarchs were subjected to the horrific, misguided medicine of the day. When royal children burned with fever, panicked doctors, clutching to ancient ignorance, repeatedly bled their tiny, weakened bodies, draining away whatever fight they had left. The invincible Louis XIV, the man who had bent nature and nobility to his absolute will, was reduced to a grieving, broken grandfather. He survived only to wander through his stinking, magnificent halls, forced to watch his mighty dynasty rot from the inside out. When the Sun King finally took his last breath in 1715, the surviving court did not mourn the loss of their glittering cage. They fled. The crown passed to a fragile, weeping 5-year-old boy, his great-grandson, Louis XV, traumatized by the suffocating death trap of Versailles. The new government completely abandoned the sprawling palace. They packed their trunks, escaped the stench, and retreated to the cleaner, more manageable air of Paris for 7 long years. It was a desperate reset, a frantic attempt to break the deadly biological spell of the previous century. But when the court eventually trickled back to Versailles, the fundamental architecture of isolation remained unchanged. They added a few private chambers and slightly better ventilation, but the massive, festering wound of systemic inequality was only deepening. Here lies the true, lingering shadow of this magnificent palace. The physical isolation meant to control the nobility had created a dangerously detached, hated elite, while the kingdom bled into staggering debt to maintain this filthy, perfumed bubble. The populace outside its iron gates starved in the mine. In the end, the very walls that Louis XIV built to protect his absolute power became the ultimate architect of its downfall. By cutting his successors off from the reality of their nation, he laid the exact structural groundwork for the French Revolution. We still look at Versailles today and marvel at its golden gates and perfect gardens. But history teaches us a terrifying lesson about power. The most impregnable fortresses are rarely breached by marching armies from the outside. They collapse from within, poisoned by the slow, invisible rot of their